Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. This is going to be the last lecture video for this class, um, and today we will talk about the final short story for this class, Cunanan's Wake by Jean Apostol. So as you probably realized, right, I call this class American Short Stories, right? And based on what we've read so far, you read stories that are all from different points of view, right? And all coming from different groups of people, right? And different styles of narrative, right? And and I think, right. Flannery O'Connor's story, right, is from the point of view of white Americans during the civil rights movement, right? And then you got Jumpalahiri, right, which is um, partly, right, Indian American sort of point of view, right, or the Indian experience in America, right. Um, and then Sonny's Blues, right, from the point of view of the Black experience, right. And for our last reading, right, you're going to get a story from a Filipino American, right, and and so I think that sort of scope, right, that very sort of like different points of view and different sort of ways of telling a story, I think is very indicative, right, of the American short stories. Because as you know, right, America as a country, but also as a culture, right, it's a very it's a very fluid one, right, and it has a very complex, it has a very violent uh, history, right, and and it's such a weird country, right, to say the least. And so the weirdness, right, of the different stories that you read, I think, somewhat kind of encapsulates that sort of uniqueness of the American short stories, right, or the American narrative in general, right. Um, but I wanted to end it with a Filipino American story, right? First, because I am Filipino American, so I'm biased, um, but also because and not just that I'm Filipino American, but also um, my research is on Filipino American literature, right? So I'm somewhat. So this is sort of. Um, this is what my work is about, right? Um, but I also think it's important to to talk about Filipino American stories because we don't really get enough Filipino American stories in um, in in schools and in universities, right, in general. We're getting a lot of representation from sort of Asian American, sort of other sort of Asian American countries, Latinx sort of experience, Black experience, right? Um, but Filipino American sort of narratives are still very much very rare, right? In sort of the academic context, right? So that's another reason. Um, but also another reason is the closeness and the sort of the intimateness of the relationship between the United States and the Philippines, right? And and that sort of relationship, right, which sort of spanned for over 100 years now, 120 years, uh, since 1898, right? And so that relationship has been a very close one, right? And so um, even stories, right, that are written in the Philippines are very much a part of the American culture, right, and vice versa, right. American sort of culture is very much a part um, of the Filipino culture, right. And so I will give you some context about that now by sort of giving you an overview, I guess, of the history of that relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. Right. So before American occupation, right, the Philippines was a colony of Spain, right, for over 400 years, right, and so there's a lot in that history that I don't have time to talk about, but so the Philippines was a colony of Spain up until 1896, up until 1896 to 1898, right, during the Spanish-American War, right. So the United States, right, wanted to expand, right, and so part of that expansion was to colonize um, Spanish territories, because at that time also, right, Spain as a colonial power, right, was also declining, and then America as a colonial power was sort of rising, right, and so America was sort of um, targeting countries that were or colonies, right, by Spain in order to take more power from Spain, right, and so part of that, right, was to occupy Puerto Rico, right, which was also a Spanish colony at the time, Cuba, right, which was also a Spanish colony at the time, Guam. I think Guam was not a Spanish colony; it was a Portuguese colony, I think. I could be wrong, right? Um, but also the Philippines, right, which was a colony, which was a Spanish colony at that time, right? So there was a war, right, during that time, the Spanish-American War, which um, uh, Spain, right, was defeated by the United States, um, and so initially, right, after the defeat, the Philippines was going to be given its independence, right, by the United States, right, but it seems like there was a lot in the Philippines that the United States could exploit and could use, right? Natural resources, sugarcane, um, yeah, sugarcane and all sorts of goods, right? Um, but sugarcane was like the most important one. Um, yeah, and so instead of just giving them their independence, the United States ended up purchasing the Philippines from Spain and making it its colony, right? Um, and so from then on, right, from around 1898, right, the Philippines became an American colony, but that was a very sort of violent occupation, right, because Filipinos didn't want to be colonized again by another country, right? They were already under Spain for 400 years and they didn't want to be colonized by the Americans. And so they fought, right? Filipino workers, Filipino farmers specifically, and Filipino revolutionaries, right? They fought the United States Army, which ended up in a very bloody battle where the the casualties ranged from 500,000 to a million Filipinos dead, right? So yeah, it was a very bloody battle, But eventually, right, the United States ended up occupying the Philippines, right? So the Philippines was an American colony from 1898 up until 1946 or 47, right, just after World War II. Um, and during that time, so about 50 years, right, of American occupation, um, or uh, the Americans, right, sort of um, opened public schools in the Philippines, and public schools where English became the main language that was spoken, right, or became the medium of instruction, right, and also they opened a lot of sort of different kinds of training, right, military training, medical training, um, and also labor training, right. That was which was an Americanized sort of training, right. And so some of you might sort of be familiar of the stereotype, right, that a lot of Filipinos are nurses, and that's not a coincidence, right, because Filipinos were actually trained by or have has or Filipino nurses, right, are trained in the American way in the Philippines because of that colonial history, right. Um, and so yeah, so that was, that was the relationship. But 1947, the United States gave the Philippines its independence, right? Um, but where the Philippines became the Republic of the Philippines, right? But then even after that independence, right, the Philippines was still in very close sort of economic relationship with the United States, right? And so there was a lot of trade of culture, right, and goods, right. And that's why, Filipino cinema, Filipino or not Filipino, but American cinema, right, and Hollywood and American products, right, are very popular in the Philippines because of that sort of economic relationship, right. And so American culture, right, is very much a part of the sort of the Filipino experience, right, and that's not a coincidence, right. That is a product of almost or over 100 years of sort of colonial and neo-colonial sort of relationship, right? Right, and so because of that history, right, and because Filipinos in the Philippines are educated in the American way and trained as laborers in the American way, right, Filipinos became the sort of the more desired laborers, right, not only for America but also all over the world, right. I don't think there is a city or country in the world where you can't find a Filipino. Maybe there's a couple, right? But my point is, right, is that there's a lot of Filipinos wherever you are in the world, right? Because of that training and because Filipinos usually are favored because they can speak sort of basic English, right? Because of that history of American education, they can speak basic English, and also they are sort of like their training, right, is sort of westernized training, right. And so that history made Filipinos become more desirable, right, as laborers all over the world, right. And it was mentioned, right, in Cunanan's wake how Filipinos are everywhere in Italy and in Europe, all over Europe, right, all over the Middle East, all over Asia, all over the United States, Australia, right. You'll see Filipinos everywhere, um, and so that sort of that very sort of complicated and very complex history, right, where the Philippines was the only Spanish colony in Asia, right, and the only American colony in Asia, right? That made Filipinos became very unique, right? Not only in their experience, but also in their looks and in their names, or in our names, right? If you noticed, right, Filipinos look less like sort of typical Eastern Asians, right? But we look more, I guess, like Mexicans or Hispanics, right? And our last names, my last name is Spanish, right? Um, our names and last names are usually Spanish, right? Because of that sort of history, right? And so there is a sense. There's a book here that I've shown before that is called The Latinos of Asia, right? So Filipinos are sort of called the Latinos of Asia, right? And so yeah, and so there is a way in which because of that complicated history, right, Filipinos can tend to become unrecognizable, right? And Filipino unrecognizability is something that I'm very interested in, right? I think I mentioned this in the last in the previous video, how we don't really fit in the sort of the typical Asian American description. We also don't fit in the typical sort of Hispanic description. We don't fit into the sort of typical sort of American description, right? And so Filipinos just kind of are in the middle of everything, right? And therefore sort of unrecognizable, right? And I actually argue in my research that that unrecognizability is not just it's actually the very sort of core, right, of the identity, right? It's not just some sort of it's not just that Filipinos are unrecognizable, and so because they don't have because we don't have our own culture, right? But being unrecognizable, right, I argue, is actually the very sort of precisely the culture of the Filipinos, right? Um, and also, Filipinos are also very good at imitation and mimicry, right? And making fun of other people's cultures, right? And parodying other languages, other cultures, other art, right? Or other sort of like artistic expression, right? Imitating and parodying, right? Puns um, uh, are very much a big part of the Filipino sort of way of life, right? Making fun of language, right? So I argue, right, that instead of just saying that yeah, Filipinos are just a bunch of imitators, right? I argue that that is actually the core of the Filipino identity, right? Um, and so now let's talk about Andrew Cunanan, right? So Cunanan's wake is named after. So Andrew Cunanan and I'm linking Andrew Cunanan to Filipino unrecognizability in just a minute. So Andrew Cunanan, right? If you're not familiar, there's a lot of documentaries, and there was actually um, a short series that came out, I think last year or 2 years ago, called Killing Versace. Right. So Gianni Versace is a very popular. You're probably familiar with him. There's like songs written about him. Bruno Mars's Versace on the Floor. Right. That's named after Gianni Versace, the very popular, very wealthy Italian designer. Right. So Gianni Versace was killed. Right. Was murdered in front of his house in Miami, right? Oh my God, let me look at when this was, what year? Right, in 1997. right? So he was murdered um, in his front gate, right? He was murdered by Andrew Cunanan, right? And and Andrew Cunanan, I don't think a lot of Filipinos knew about, or I don't think a lot of people knew about it. But Andrew Cunanan was, I think he was half Filipino, half Italian, and half Filipino. So his father was Filipino, and then his mother was Italian, right? And so Cunanan also was a serial killer, right? He killed a few people before he killed Gianni Versace. He already killed a few people who were influential, and he was already on the run, right? He was sort of going around America, and the FBI was sort of looking for him, right? And then his last kill was Gianni Versace, and then he sort of he got caught right after, or I think a couple of days after he killed Versace. But then, right when he got caught, he killed himself, right? He shot himself, right? When the SWAT teams sort of before the SWAT team could arrest him, right? Um, and yeah, so Gianni Versace was murdered by Andrew Cunanan, right? And Andrew Cunanan um, was sort of Filipino American, right? But not a lot of people knew that, because Andrew Cunanan sort of, he kind of like looked, he had like a Spanish look. He also had like an Italian look. He was a very good looking man, right? And that's why he was able to, I think, like he socialized with, he was also like a very, he was a social climber. He loved being sort of in sort of very kind of like extravagant parties. He liked being invited, in extravagant parties. He liked being friends with rich people, right? So he had this sort of obsession, right, with the sort of the luxurious life, right? And he was a very good-looking gay man. Um, and so he used his good looks, right, to sort of seduce and sort of make money, right, off of some of his lovers, right. Um, and it was said that he and Versace sort of had a relationship, but also Versace's family said that they never met, right? So they said that he was lying when he said that he has met Versace before, right? And they were saying that he was just obsessed with Versace and how sort of how fabulous Versace's life was, that he got jealous and killed him, right? And so that's the story of Andrew Cunanan, right? Um, and the FBI even went to the Philippines, right, to look for him while he was sort of on the run, right? And so some critics have written about Andrew Cunanan and how he is an example of Filipino unrecognizability, right? And his like ability, right, to sort of just hide behind the radar and not be identified, right, for a very long time. I think a couple of years before they caught him, right? His sort of ability to sort of hide under the radar, right, was sort of like um, was a product, right, of his sort of like Filipino background, which made him sort of unrecognizable, right? Right. So that's Andrew Cunanan, right? And so the story, right? To go to the story, so there's a lot of context, right? Um, and this is something that Gina Apostol has also said in one of the interviews, is that Filipino American novels, you can't really, it's hard to explain it, or it's hard to put it in a narrative that is beginning, middle, end, right? Because it is so complicated and it's so complex that the only way that you can tell the story in a somewhat truthful way is just to to give out information, whether you understand it or not. That's out of the question, right? It's the point is, like, it's okay if you don't understand a lot of the things, right, about this story, because that's precisely because um, the Filipino sort of narrative is also very hard to understand, right? And it's unrecognizable, right? That is the quality of the Filipino experience and the Filipino American experience. So it's okay, but I'm going to give you as much context as possible, right? So that you can kind of, get a better understanding, right? And so Andrew Cunanan, right? His father was from the Philippines, and so the story then, Gina Apostol's story, is set in a small sort of town, right, in the Philippines. The town is not named, right? It's just called San Blanc, right? So the town is not named, but it looks like it's set in a small town, not just a town, but a barangay, right? So barangay is so small towns in the Philippines are divided into smaller, towns or cities, right, are divided into smaller barangays, right? So smaller sections of the town, right? And each barangay has so each town has a mayor, right? And then each town has smaller barangays, and then each barangay has a captain or a kapitan, right? But in this case, the captain, right, is a woman, so she's called kapitana, right? So that's what a kapitana means. It's just a captain of that small sort of barangay or area of the town, right? So it's a very local story, right? Set in this small barangay or town, right, in the Philippines. But they are sort of somewhat connected, right, to Andrew Cunanan, because one of their sort of like neighbors, right, or one of like one of the people from that barangay, right, is said to be related to Andrew Cunanan. Right. It's hard to say if that's actually true or not. Right. Maybe there's a lot of Cunanans in the world, right, or in the Philippines. Right. So but they're saying, right, that they're actually related, right? And so this group of people, right, from that barangay, um, and specifically the kapitana, right, feels sort of obliged to do a wake, right, for Andrew Cunanan's death, right, after he killed himself. Um, Right. So that's kind of right the context or the setting of that story. Right. Before I move on to the story, um, I just want to sort of describe some key terms. Right. So already talked about kapitana, which is the female captain. Barangay is the smaller sections of the town. Lechon, some of you might know, is a whole roasted pig. Right. It's delicious. Um, Basi is fermented sugarcane juice, right? So that's what they're drinking, right? That's the alcoholic drink that everyone drinks in the story. Bakla, right, means generally the American translation would be a gay person, right? A gay man, right? But bakla actually it's more complicated than just a gay man, right? Because it's sort of it spans the spectrum of cross dressers, right? So gay man who likes to dress as women, right? Sort of transgendered women, right? Those who sort of feel like they are female in a man's body, right? So and then also just gay men, right? And so that sort of spectrum, right, sort of can be described as bakla, right? But that's why I don't like to sort of translate it as just gay, right? Because most people would just say, oh, bakla means gay, right? but it's actually a more sort of complex term that has more sort of that covers a larger spectrum, right? But typically, right, it's bakla is used here to describe Andrew Cunanan, who is gay, and then bakla is also used to describe the Capitana's son, Joey, right, who is said to be effeminate gay, right? So it seems like maybe Joey is gay, but also likes to cross-dress, right? Gay or gay men in the Philippines cross-dressing as women, right, is very common, right? You see a lot of that in the Philippines, right? And so yeah, so that's sort of like the context of bakla. TNT, right, or tago ng tago, which means hide and hide, right? So that's TNT means it is now sort of um, used to describe undocumented Filipinos, right? Which means that undocumented Filipinos, they hide, right? They hide and they hide. And so that's why it's called TNT, which means tago ng tago, right? So putang ina is also a phrase used throughout the story. It just means the exact translation is your mother is a bitch or your mother is a whore, right? But we use that as frequently as Americans would the say fuck you, right? So that's our. It has a different meaning, but that's our version of fuck you, right? So putang ina mo, right? Your mother is a whore. So that's kind of uh, that's an expression, right? Okay, before I jump into the story, um, I just want to take a passage from the essay. I also assigned you um, uh, an essay that Gina Apostol wrote, right? The link is on the syllabus. So if you can, check that out. But I want to read a passage here from that essay, right? So for better or worse, when I write short stories, which tend to be about individuals trying to figure out their place in their culture or their culture's place in wider culture, right? I keep hearing Dr. Tiempo's aesthetic, tangential divagation, a split in style, right? So I like that, how she describes her stories as filled with individuals trying to figure out their place in their culture, right, or their culture's place in a wider culture, right. And so there is a sense, right, that the story is set in in a very small town in the Philippines, right, but it has connections to America, right, through Andrew Cunanan, right. But it also has a connection to Italy, right, through Gianni Versace, right, because the same time that they were doing Conanan's Wake, there was also this grand uh, sort of wake for Gianni Versace in Italy, right, um, where Elton John performed, right, and everyone was just, you know, um, all the who's who of Hollywood and politics and important people in the world were there, right? And so you get this juxtaposition, right, of this very simple wake given to a person that they really don't know, right? And then here you have Gianni Versace's wake also, right? So yeah, so you get that sense that it's these individuals, right, have some kind of connection to the world, right, at large, right, and they have their own opinions too, right, about Cunanan, right. Some of them sort of like Capitana, right. Capitana is very sympathetic, or the women in general, right. Um, they are very sympathetic towards Cunanan, right. They think that he was a victim of circumstance, and that he deserved a sort of a countryman's sort of wake, right, even though he was a murderer, right. But then also you get other Filipinos, especially the men, who were very critical of him, right. A, because he's gay, also because he's a murderer, but also because he sort of bring a bad reputation, right, to the Philippines, right. So you get this sort of like different points of view about Cunanan's wake, right. Um, and so yeah, and so I think it is, yeah, it's important, right, um, to think of that local experience, right, and link it, right, to, because there's always that sort of link, right, and that's why, like, whatever story you tell in the Philippines, right, because of that long history of the Philippine and American relation, right, whatever story you tell in the Philippines, it will always be linked to America, right, or to the larger world, right, because of that sort of very complex history. Right. In terms of narrative point of view, right, it's kind of confusing um, because we start with the point of view of we, right? So we elected Swanee mayor because blah blah blah, right? And then our, right? So the narrator is us, right, in the first sort of section. And then the second section, right, on page 40, starting Benedicto Amolar, the college boy, came up from the city and accosted us with the news. He slapped Budoy's drinking arm with a newspaper, spilling his basi. Hey, isn't this guy your cousin? Careful, boy, Budoy warned. He whistled. Wait, right. So, sorry. Actually, so that's page 40, right? And then page 41, and then page 42, right? You get the narrative here, right? So Taranta came with a new pitcher of Basi and a glass of Coke. She waddled over, oily as an emperor penguin. I watched the way her blouse stuck to her, a sheet of cellophane kissing the moon. I love every woman I see, right? So that it turned into an I, right? And so it's kind of curious, like, who is this I, right? That's speaking, um, right? So that's one way, right? And I'm sure, right, Gina Apostol is doing something, right, with that narrative point of view, changing it from we to I, right? I'm not sure what yet, but if you want to write about that, feel free, right? Um, and so there's also the theme of so basically the story, right, is there's all these kind of like local characters, and they're just kind of drinking and eating lechon, right? And lechon, right, the roasted pig, and and then they got into a conversation about Andrew Cunanan, right? And then um, the Capitana decided to do a wake, right, in honor not only of Andrew Cunanan, but in honor of Cunanan's family, right, in that town, right. So she decided um, to do a wake for Cunanan, right, where she would provide two lechons, right, so two whole roasted pigs, right. So that in itself is a feast, right, and that's a very sort of like um, Filipino type sort of wake, right, where there's a lot of food. A lot of times, in my experience, it's a lot of food. There's gambling. It's actually more of a festivity, right, um, than um, than sort of a moment of grieving, right. Um, yeah, and then so they had a wake, right, where they invited professional mourners, right? So professional mourners, and this is another aspect of the complexity of the Philippine history, right? Because throughout its history, Philippines had a very close relationship, trading relationship with China, right? So we also get a lot of Chinese influences in the country, and one of those is professional mourners, right? Uh, Part of sort of Chinese history is during mourning, right? I think they would hire professional mourners because they believe that the more people cry and the louder people cry, right? That will be sort of like good omen for the soul of the dead person, right? And so that sort of tradition, right, carried on to the Philippines, right, where there's actually, there's actual people whose jobs are called crying ladies, right, where they are hired to sort of to go to funerals and wakes, right, and they would just go there and cry, right. They're professional crying ladies, right, and they would get hired just to cry, right. And so they were professional mourners, right? Um, so that's sort of like a Chinese sort of tradition that got carried in the Philippines. Um, so yeah, so there's professional mourners, um, and everyone was just sort of talking shit, right, about Cunanan, and why were they even sort of like um, doing a wake for him when he was when he was a murderer, and he was sort of like a bad seed, and um, they were also sort of very judgmental about him being gay, right? And also there's that character, right, of Joey, who is Capitana's son, right? Um, and we don't really get a lot of information about Joey other than they don't really like Joey. The men, right, sort of judge Joey because he is sort of effeminate, right? He's gay, he's bakla, and he's effeminate, right? And so, and I think maybe that's why sort of Capitana um, feels bad or sympathizes with Cunanan, right? Is because he or she has a gay son also, right? Um, and and yeah, and so it's so weird because like the gay son is sort of just there, right? Um, but he's not sort of his character is not sort of we don't see a lot of the we don't get a lot of information about his character, right? Um, and then so like they were just kind of like talking shit, right, about Cunanan, and then all of a sudden Capitana took a took a gun, right, and and shot at the lechon, the roasted pig, right, um, and which just kind of like just put everyone in a shock, right, and then so she shot the pig, and then they replaced it with a brand new pig, right, and then they just kind of continued eating, right, so because Capitana was just sort of um, I think wanted to, or I don't know. Maybe she just got like really pissed, right? Because all she was providing all this food, and then everyone was just kind of complaining, right? So lastly, there's this kind of like long passage that I want to read, right? Then we can kind of I'll talk a little bit about it, and it starts on page 50 um, up until page 51, right? So in Milan, the Versace family had held a funeral filled with dark Italian veils, a high mass with Elton John. Right? The society pages of Manila's newspapers ran the photos of it as if it were the death of one of their own. Right? Milan merely the capital's anagram, and Italy a province along Patrenco south. The expanded territory claimed by the papers had grown, a Filipino immigration became bolder as more versatile. Right? Fishermen in Penang, cabin crews in the Caribbean, nurses in Denmark, translators in China, busboys in Brussels, telemarketers in Texas, housekeepers in Hollywood, phone technicians in Indonesia, basketball players in Daran. Even Italy was full of Filipinos, dusting the Murano treasures of the rich. No wonder we felt the world was our own home, and Versace, abattoir, our boudoir. right? Filipinos were everywhere, in the bedrooms of privies, the boiler rooms, the cocktail parties, the kitchens, the bowers, the staterooms, and the sewers of the idle rich. We could swallow the world. Thus, the newsman in Manila should have scorned the festivities in Milan to reflect the jaundiced eyes, for instance, of an expatriate cook in a Roman home who can concoct all kinds of ravioli in her sleep, but who dreams of adobo, who picks up Italian slang without a sweat, but longs only for her humid home. Right. I think that's a really sort of important passage, right? Because again, right, it's sort of describing the different roles that Filipinos play all over the world, right? China, Denmark, Brussels, like that's Belgium, um, even in the Caribbean, right? Most of the crew members, right, of cruise ships, right, are Filipinos, right? Um, Nurses in Denmark, right? Telemarketers, right? Housekeepers, everywhere, right? And so the sort of the narrator here, right, is saying that the newspaper, right, the Filipino newspaper that's based in Manila, the front page news was Versace's death, right, which was this kind of like fabulous thing. But the narrator is saying here that why don't we talk about Filipinos and why do we talk about Versace, right, when there are sort of important Filipinos all over the world, right, that whose stories need to be told, right, and stories of uh, look at here, right, on page 51. For instance, of an expatriate cook in a Roman home who can concoct all kinds of ravioli in her sleep, but who dreams of adobo, right, who picks up Italian slang without a sweat, but longs only for her humid home, right. So this also talks about how good Filipinos are as workers, as imitators, right. So she's very good at cooking ravioli, right, that sort of typical Italian dish. Um, but then she longs for adobo. Adobo is a very typical sort of Filipino dish, right? And she's also very quick to pick up Italian language, right? Um, but um, but she still dreams of going home, right? To um, the humid Philippines, right? Um, and so yeah, so Filipinos are very good workers, very sort of very good imitators, very good, but then after all of that, right, there's still this sense that they long for home, right, or there's no place like home, right, um, and so that sort of story, right, this narrator is saying should be what is being told, right, and more stories like this, right, should be sort of told, right. Um, yeah, and so there's also another aspect of this short story which I don't have time to talk about, nor do I know how to talk about, right? So if you notice, there's artworks, right, sort of throughout the short story. And these are sort of paintings, most of them are paintings, some of them are murals, some of them are collages, right, by Filipino artists, right? And they don't really correspond to sort of the story not directly, right? They're sort of they're doing their own thing, but there are some connections, right? And I think that sort of disparity, right, is again part of that unrecognizability of the Filipino narrative, right? And so, if you have any ideas on what you think the artworks, right, are doing in this story, and you want to write about that, yeah, feel free to do that. That's a very interesting topic. Right. So I think, yeah, like I really just wanted to give out context, right, about the story. Um, so yeah, I hope you sort of or that lecture was helpful to you, and thank you very much um, for being in my class and for participating as much as you can. Right? Obviously, it's a very difficult sort of setting, right, to sort of participate in. But I hope you learned as much as you can, or from my class, right? As much as I sort of enjoyed doing the lectures. And I will stay in touch with you through email, um, and I wish you all well. Thank you.